Hello everyone, greetings from the Servant of Nero, AJ here, with a somewhat different take on the common factor that links all of the main War Machine factions of War Machine and Hordes. That's War Machine in isolation as opposed to the game as a whole, and main because some factions or sub-factions just had to be different. No surprise in that what follows will primarily concern warjacks, but not in a traditional way as far as lore content is concerned, as most who are into War Machine and Hordes are probably aware of the history behind the development of the cortex and the warjack by way of Colossal. The elephant in the room is probably use of the word bond in the context of warjacks and their controlling warcasters, which has a somewhat different definition in-game from its use in-world, a distinction which also applies to warbeasts and warlocks. To clarify, in World and in Iron Kingdom's RPG, a bond is simply the connection between a warcaster and a warjack in its battle group. But in the skirmish game, a bond is an effect that a character jack has while under the control of one particular warcaster character. However, this is the in-world and RPG definition of an imprint, which in War Machine and Hordes is a special ability a character jack can have irrespective of who controls it. The sticking point comes in that almost every jack in World is a character jack, while they're a small minority on the tabletop. But no matter, herein is a brief treatment of the minutiae of jack design, construction, maintenance, and their potential for individuality. The starting point for the construction of any jack, whether labor jack or warjack, is fundamentally its cortex, which may simplistically be compared to a creature's brain. A warjack in isolation is governed solely by what behaviours are taught, experienced, and conditioned into its cortex, which is located close behind or below the jack's head, depending on chassis design. And this is irrespective of whether it is commanded in battle by a jack marshal or controlled more directly by a warcaster, who is generally better able to make the most of a warjack's combat ability, whether by direct control or the investment of magical resource. Thus, it is worth noting that the sophistication and intricacy, or perhaps more plainly, the quality of a cortex in its design or its construction is a great factor in the capabilities, longevity, and, shall we say, quirkiness of the warjack that the cortex is implanted in, or built around in some cases. However, this does not take away from the fact that the cortex, almost irrespective of its maker, no matter their nation or their race, has the same core design principles across all of Imoran. To quote an Arcanist's handbook concerning the cortex, the cortex is a sphere constructed from various metals, crystals, and rare trace minerals, wrapped in a series of carefully etched flexible plates. Each cortex has multiple layers, often containing 20 to 30 alchemically treated copper, silver, or gold foiled spheres. Metal spines interconnect these layers, acting as arcane meridians. The primary focus, a crystal orb, sits in the center of the sphere. Along the three primary axes of the cortex are connection sockets, one that hooks up to the turbine conduits, another that connects to the reflex trigger conduit, and a third that connects the cortex to the jack's sensory equipment. A variety of baffles and tightly wound springs protect the cortex from shock and provide stability. And so on and so forth, with details and pointless ignorant flourishes. Because of the wealth of necessary resources that are invested in a cortex's construction, whether in money, materials, an arcanist's craftsmanship, or military innovation, all jack owners and operators take measures to make sure that their valued assets do not fall into unwelcome hands, which could be anything from opportunistic thieves or industrial rivals to enemies of the state. Consequently, even the most rudimentary security systems are quite complicated as far as the concept of programming the cortex in question is concerned. Labor jacks, being controlled by jack marshals rather than warcasters, are most often secured by a series of specific code phrases that must be recited to a jack to have it recognize their handler or handlers and become fully activated. Depending on the industry that they're used in, labor jacks often have receptive mode that can be engaged with an easily accessible switch, allowing quick transfer among jack marshals. A labor jack can easily be commandeered by a warcaster, though, who can bypass the verbal code phrases by direct contact with the cortex, but understandably, labor jacks are generally of little value or use to warcasters. Warjacks, on the other hand, being a military asset that is nominally key to the defence of a nation, have more stringent security measures, and are protected from conventional enemy military control by not only verbal codes, but mental ones, called cortex locks, that must be communicated to a warjack's cortex directly upon contact to activate. These mental codes are typically a series of images that, once accepted by the warjack, allow a bond with the attending warcaster. This then psychically tethers machine to arcanist, making it responsive to even the swiftest commands. Once the bond is established, the warcaster can apply their own mental codes to more easily activate the warjack while they're at rest. And it allows the warjack to recognize their controller more quickly when the bond is reformed after rest periods. As befits military caution and the state of alert that exists among all nations these days, most cortex locks are updated regularly. Cortex quality is also a major factor in both a jack's intended function and its propensity for acquiring and keeping behavioral quirks, whether positive or negative. Generally speaking, the grading of a cortex is associated with the quality of craftsmanship of and the rune etching on its aforementioned alchemically treated spheres, which contribute to the complexity of commands that the cortex and the jack it is installed in can carry out competently. From lowest to highest, the grades of cortex by human reckoning are cupernum, ferrum, aurum, and arcanum grade. More than anything else, cupernum grade cortexes are the realm of the most penny-pinching entrepreneur, the most down on their luck freelance jack marshal, or the journeyman arcanist who is yet to master the art of constructing cortexes. For a labour jack with this grade of cortex installed is of inferior functionality, simple intellect, and very naive personality at best. Ferrum grade cortexes are generally what can be found in labour jacks, for they provide full functionality for the jack and allowance for complex commands, but struggle to develop abilities suited to combat. As the sequence would suggest, aurum grade cortexes, or their equivalent, are what most warjacks have installed, being advanced enough to allow steady learning of battle requirements and understanding orders given mid-combat. The occasional aurum grade cortex can be found in labour jacks though, should its tasks be complicated enough to warrant such a high level of intelligence. And lastly, the arcanum grade cortex is the work of master arcanists, and naturally, comparatively few such specimens exist. Found most commonly in prototype warjacks or specialised high-performance warjack chassis, they possess intelligence and cunning in quantity to the point of displaying instinctive behaviours, and thus develop beneficial habits and unique personalities very quickly. These personalities are fundamentally comparable to those of dogs. Lower grade cortexes result in jacks that express behaviour akin to young puppies, and they need to be treated as such. This necessitates training that broadly equates to educating the jack to, for example, not accidentally making a mess of their intended place of work, understand that they should stay in their storage space at certain times, keep their hands to themselves when not performing their intended labour tasks, or to not step on everything in their path, whether it be commodity, actual dogs, or people. Even warjacks need this conditioning to a certain extent, so that they aren't potentially as much of a hazard to friendly soldiers as to enemy soldiers. How jacks learn and develop is also tied to cortex quality. The higher the grade, the faster individuality grows in the cortex, and the greater the likelihood that it obtains quirks that are beneficial to their purpose. Broadly though, labour jacks improve in efficiency and effectiveness in their work, performing their tasks with less and less instruction, while picking up behavioural traits of the marshals that oversee them most. Similarly, warjacks develop in combat skill as they practice with their weapons, and then as they experience actual battle. If they are commanded by jack marshals, they come to require less by way of explicit commands, and can almost be as responsive as battle group warjacks, should they and their marshal obtain enough experience together. For warcasters, due to the mental connection that links mind and cortex, warjacks that are bonded to their controller repeatedly quickly develop traits that are a direct reflection of, or an emulation of, said warcaster. Sometimes, though, the warjack can be so closely bonded to a warcaster as to be almost inoperable by anyone else, or at the very least, much less effective under another's control, having acquired an imprint that manifests only when bonded to said particular warcaster. Normally, though, no matter who controls the warjack, over time they gain notable quirks based on who, what, and even where they fight, and in some cases if they are subjected to similar battlefield circumstances on a regular basis. Another source of individuality in jacks are the imperceptible flaws on the plates of the cortex which, given their intricacy and the necessary expertise required to be able to construct even the simplest design, can be more common than expected. While they may not have any effect on the jack's ability to perform its designated functions, they can nonetheless contribute to certain habits or the likelihood of acquiring certain habits. This can include, but is by no means limited to, idle movements, pose when standing at ready, way of holding its weapons, expression of analogues of emotion, and so on and so forth. Just as necessary to a jack's operation as the cortex, if a great deal cheaper to construct, is the steam engine, which is the collective label for a boiler, a firebox, and an arcane steam turbine. While this is particular to steamjacks that are endemic to the human powers of Warren and their Rhulic neighbours, and other forms of power plants exist for jacks, there is little doubt that steamjacks make up the vast majority of all manufactured jack chassis in existence. Indeed, only a very small handful of chassis designs do not use either the steam engine or a variant of it. The design and layout of this steam engine is logical for the most part, with an easily accessible hopper into which coal can be fed, with a flexible transfer system that loads it into the firebox in quantities based on the jack's present needs. Likewise, water is fed from a reservoir to the boiler in a similar fashion, the resulting steam pressure driving the pistons and valves that allow the jack to move. Some of the excess pressure generated is directed to the arcane turbine, providing energy to the cortex and the systems connected to it, including the sensory arrays that allows the jack to perceive its surroundings. But keeping a jack fully functional continuously is a costly endeavour, and it must be fully refueled every day to maintain activity around the clock. This is something that military commanders need to bear in mind, for not only do their warjacks require ammunition, like their conventional forces, but also large quantities of refined coal, so as to not limit the capabilities of warcasters and their battle groups. Well-organised logistics is thus integral to any military in the Iron Kingdoms. These supply line issues lead to the importance of railways and well-placed railheads. To save on coal, and because troop movements across country are typically facilitated by train, so moving warjacks with the soldiers they fight alongside is a sensible approach in many ways. This means that the warjacks can arrive at battlefields almost guaranteed to have full or close to full hoppers of coal. Under full battle conditions, a typical warjack's endurance is quite limited, being roughly 2 hours of continual combat, and this can be severely reduced thanks to damage suffered or undue strain because of inefficient deployment. As to long-term manufacturing policies, throughout the Iron Kingdoms, the nations that employ jacks have different approaches, as to be expected, though the operators of conventional steamjacks tend to be quite similar in this regard. The prevailing convention is that steamjack workshops of all sizes and specialties can be found in most nations, as traditions prominent in the Iron Kingdoms era and the modern era originate from Cador and Signar, as the two largest producers of steamjacks of most varieties. Small workshops that comprise only a handful of arcanists, artisans and mechanics typically specialise in providing custom labourjacks for companies and industries that require more refined cortexes, but not necessarily a great many of them. Larger workshops deal mainly with more commonly available chassis and cortexes, whether it is maintenance, adjustments, or construction, under license or of original design. The largest factories are the military ones, such as the Signarin Armoury in Caspia and the Rigevnia complex in Kursk, which suits the centralized nature of military institutions and unified approach to arms development. However, in both cases, these factories serve more as assembly sites for the final warjacks rather than a start-to-end construction site. Indeed, in a convention that is found in the manufacture of the Colossals during the latter years of the rebellion against the Orgoth, the parts and components are made across the country and shipped to assembly sites from which warjacks march forth. Facilities of this type will work on a small number of chassis types, and upon completing a warjack, it is tested by mechanics with marshalling knowledge, and then a junior warcaster for performance and behavioural tolerances. Only when these checks and exams are passed does the warjack leave and be assigned to a unit. If not, it is taken apart and flaws are identified, with the offending components replaced as needed. A slight divergence. Returning to the manufacturing process. Typically, the large components, such as the armour plating and limbs, are fabricated close to a source of construction material, such as the ore refineries of steel water flats for the Signarin warjacks, or the Cadoran Mechanics Assembly in Cardiff, for the Cadoran warjacks obviously. The sensory arrays, optics, reflex channels that comprise the jack's nervous system, and other finer parts of a warjack's body, are produced in separate studios or in workshops adjacent to the main fabrication facilities. Intensive work by hand is required to produce these parts in both qualities and quantities that are demanded by their nation's military, and most importantly are the cortexes, which are made separately by arcanists with appropriate education in this most delicate of crafts. Military-grade examples used by the major powers are exclusively made by arcanists from the official arcane organizations affiliated to the military or crown. But as strategic considerations change, fabrication and assembly sites can expand or diminish. To illustrate this, the invasions of Caspia by the Protectorate and Lael by Cador led, respectively, to the expansion of production facilities at steel water flats to create necessary reserve stockpiles, and Rhulic because of the proximity of captured Laelese assets. But naturally, not all powers in Western Amoran follow the Signarin, Cadoran, or similar line of thought when it comes to designing, manufacturing, and assembling jacks. And not all jacks adhere strictly to the tried and tested formula of a cortex housed alongside a steam engine within a protected chassis. Some use different fuels, while others have succeeded in changing the cortex into something slightly different, and others yet use technologies and designs that are far removed from this norm.